Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Thomas's Reading Room number 2. We finished with Trip Across the Pond that's in the other account. Now this account here that you can type in the search there, Thomas Could Read Again, and it will take you here, or even Thomas Reading Room 2 will take you here. And we started it with this, but then we had the holidays, and I wish that everybody enjoyed their people's holiday. Now we're in 2013, so we're going to get moving and doing the 2-year travel adventure story with Susan, the car, Howard, and I. So let's get going now. And we start with, due to the size, cost of repair, and condition of the medium-sized station wagon, I decided to look for a more suitable vehicle with adventure in mind. I wanted a vehicle that would be easily and inexpensively repaired, and somewhat small. Mechanically inclined and having a good supply of mechanical tools, I would make all the necessary repairs. The car also would have to get good gas mileage. Should the exterior of the car be in poor shape, such as dents or faded paint, so much the better. After searching through newspapers and magazines, I phoned a few prospective ads inquiring about the nature of the cars and when I could see them. I borrowed a friend's vehicle and traveled to the locations of the cars I remained interested in. I became astounded by the seemingly high price of nothing more than pure junk, other than they started, the engines operated, with a struggle. I found nothing under $550 except the last place I arrived where the owner was asking $500. Getting out of the car, I observed a young man walking around a vehicle parked in the driveway. I told him I had come to look at the car for sale. He reported he was the husband of the woman who owned the car and he was waiting for her to come home. He went on to say he and the wife were having domestic problems. They were separated and he seemed distraught. We walked over to the car, a station wagon, import, with the original red paint faded and worn. In some places, gray primer was showing. In a few other places, the metal was exposed. This is definitely a desert car. The body seemed in good shape, no dents or rust, except the front bumper and grille were pushed in at the center. The parking lights, rearview mirror, and the door latch, driver's side that mounts onto the door post, were missing. The remedy for keeping the door closed was a slide bolt mounted onto the rear part of the door below the window by 4 screws, and a punch-made hole through the metal in the door post. The door did not close entirely. However, I could see where that would be okay as long as it did not rain. The interior was nothing to write home about either. The headliner was a gray color and torn in a few places. The passenger seat looked as though someone had poured grease on the seat part. The flat floorboards were covered with a beige shag rug that someone probably had discarded due to it being worn and soiled. The door panels were gray, the dash black, and heavily soiled with dirt. The man reached through the open window on the driver's side, pulled the hood latch, and released the hood. He lifted the hood and I observed the engine. It was a 1200cc 4-cylinder with a 4-speed transmission. The man removed the radiator cap, checking the water. Disgusted, he said, "She hasn't taken very good care of it." I turned, observing a woman in a car driving to the side of the driveway. She stopped, got out with a young boy, and walked over to where we were standing. I introduced myself, telling her, "I'm interested in the car, and I would like to drive it if I may." She said, "Sure, I will go inside and get the key." Soon she returned. She gave me the key and went back inside with the boy. I pushed against the driver's door, moving the bolt back, opening the door, then stepping inside, I sat. I latched the door by moving the bolt into the punch hole. The woman's husband had already seated himself in the car. I inserted the key into the ignition and the engine started immediately. The odometer read 54,000 miles, which a woman later swore to be the actual mileage. I backed out the driveway and drove onto a major street. Every time the front tires came upon an irregularity in the road, something Phoenix is noted for, the front wheels would shake. I was compelled to brake, coming to a near stop before they would cease shaking. The rear center member provided a howling, whining noise that would seemingly deafen anyone. The steering, front suspension, was loose, giving the car a lateral movement without turning the steering wheel. Other than this, the engine, clutch, transmission, brakes, and U-joints seemed in good working condition. Driving back, the husband commented, it might need some work, but I don't understand because she just had the front end fixed and new brakes installed. I entertained the thoughts. All this young woman is asking for this fine piece of machinery is $500. She told me later she had paid $1,400 for it last year. Back at the house, I entertained more thoughts of what I was experiencing, what I could do with a fine piece of machinery without a large investment. I told the woman I would give her $450 for it. She seemed reluctant and wanted to say no, but I mesmerized her with a twinkle of the eyes. The car was mine. Little did I realize at the time, without this car and its character, the 2 years throughout the USA may not have been possible. I left, going back to the friend's house and reporting the events experienced. We laughed, then got into his car and drove to the woman's house. I got into the vehicle and humbly, successfully drove it to the office. The next day, I drove the car to an establishment that does front-end work. The people there put it on a lift, observed and checked the front suspension. They reported the cost of repair would be more than the worth of the vehicle. They pointed out different parts that needed replacing, saying the cost would be around $200. I thanked them, and after they removed the car from the lift, I left for the office. As time permitted, I replaced the defective parts itself: the pitman arm, idler, tie rods, ball joints, parking lights, and rear view mirror. I had 4 new tires installed and the front end aligned. The investment for the car and parts came to $617. I purchased a luggage rack consisting of 6 bars and retaining straps to hold the luggage. I placed these bars, spreading them an even distance over the roof, then placed a fiberboard on top of the bars. I took pictures I had created for the foundation, had them enlarged, then I taped them to the inside windows of the station wagon. Using a gray paint, I sprayed the inside windows around the pictures. This would conceal the contents from people that might wish to break in, and it would provide advertisement for the foundation. This car definitely had character, and I signed it the name Howard, with no special reason for doing so. For all the practical intentions and purpose, this car shall be known hereafter as Howard. I was sitting in the office with, I might tell you now because we're in the darker type ink, and this is where Susan is speaking. So I'm not going to sound like a woman. I was sitting in the office with Thomas, listening to him express the need for a sign to take with us. He said it will be very important wherever we camp as we travel throughout the USA. It will show the people who observe us that we are not various retired persons who are filling the highways, RV, and state parks. Nor are we the transients who seem to have no aim or direction other than to survive from day to day. Those that observe us will see that we have a cause. We are professional, organized, and we are doing something with an aim, a direction in mind. Thomas wrote down various phrases that we would like the sign to read and eventually centered on one. Thomas K. Dugan Foundation, Susan, Howard, and I, winging the way throughout the USA. Thomas and I went to a home improvement center for material to construct the sign. The material needed was a fiberboard 22 by 14 inches, a 10-foot wooden stake, vinyl self-sticking black letters, and a spray can of plastic sealer. We returned to the office and began constructing the sign. I glued a manila paper to one side of the fiberboard, applied the vinyl letters, and sprayed the front with plastic sealer to protect it from water. Thomas cut 6 feet of the wooden stake to various size pieces and created a slot on the back of the sign using glue only. The 4-foot piece left over was made pointed at one end to be driven in the ground easily. The other end, top, will slide into the slot on the back of the sign. When it came time for Susan and me to figure out what we were going to offer at the flea markets, the idea came forth to ordain ministers in the Universal Life Church Incorporated, in which I had started a congregation in 1980. To speak on the reasons for starting a congregation does not seem appropriate here. However, I will say I remain without any deep convictions of any religion. It seemed obvious that after loading Howard there would be no room to store other materials. Ordaining ministers consisted of only 2 poster board signs and a yellow envelope containing credentials, receipts, and other literature. After allowing the idea to flow through the field of the minds, we agreed that we would ordain ministers. The night had presented itself, and the office complex was vacant at the conclusion of the work day. We began loading Howard, placing the things that we would be using more often where they would be the easiest to get out. Inside, Howard covering the back seat, we laid a travel-size ironing board, 2 bamboo curtains, 2 garment bags containing suits, sport coats, jackets, dresses, sleeping bags, guitar, 4 pillows, blankets. On the floor were shoes and small boxes of office supplies. At the rear compartment of Howard, we placed a personal file box, church box, foundation box, 2 briefcases, 3 2-pound containers of dehydrated potatoes, 7 songbooks, cook stove, medium-sized brown suitcase, lantern, tent, 2-gallon gas can, machete, wood saw, hammer, gloves, jumper cables, 4 boxes of assorted tools, first aid, satchel, typewriter, and a 5-gallon container of water. Another 5-gallon container will be filled at Buckeye and placed on the floor on the passenger side of Howard. On top of Howard, we laid a blue tarpaulin across the fiberboard. We placed a box containing a fan belt, radiator hoses, water pump, fuel pump, distributor, starter, 2 boxes of food, boxes of utensils, large suitcase, vinyl bag containing towels and washcloths, foam pads to sleep on, iron, the foundation sign, 2 ordination signs, and last a folding table 5 feet by 30 inches. We pulled another blue tarpaulin over the top, tucking the sides first, then the ends underneath the fiberboard. I took the 6 straps and placed them over the top and tightened them. I taped the 8 pyramid tubes together and placed them between the straps and the blue tarpaulin, resting on the luggage rack at the edge of the rough line. Then I tied them with a rope to the luggage rack. Finally, the time had come to give Susan a ride home. I dropped her off, bidding a good night, and drove back to the office where I laid out a sleeping bag and concluded the day. To avoid people coming to work, I woke early so I could use the restroom to clean myself in privacy. Finished, I returned to the office and picked up the sleeping bag. I closed and locked the office door, got in Howard, started the engine, and drove to a nearby restaurant. There I enjoyed a cup of tea and read a newspaper before going to pick up Susan. Once at Susan's, we greeted each other to the new day. I put a few more things in Howard, then drove us to Buckeye, approximately 41 miles south, where we stopped at a convenience store. I filled a 5-gallon water container, purchased some bread, butter, and a couple of apples. We continued on to a recreation area approximately 7 miles southwest of Buckeye. I approached a sign stating the recreation area and turned right onto a gravel road, observing a sign reading, "No water." I drove onward approximately 2 miles to an area that had picnic sites on the inside of the road as we went around a horseshoe-shaped drive. I drove us by an area that had compost toilets, observing 2 motorhomes parked in front. Driving a short distance farther, I stopped to the left side of the road in front of what seemed to be an ideal location for us. We got out of Howard and observing the sagging rear leaf springs, no doubt about it, Howard had all the weight he could handle. The engine delivers 65 horsepower. However, there is a loss of 30 to 35 horsepower perhaps when it has traveled through the drivetrain, arriving at the rear wheels. I had already experienced loss of power, having to gear down on the smallest of inclines en route to the recreation area. Again, we have Susan speaking. Thomas and I stood by Howard for a few moments, listening and soaking in the rays of the sun. I began entertaining the thoughts that it seemed important for me to take a good, long look at the desert. I would be leaving it to experience different types of terrain throughout the USA, and it would be 2 years before I experienced the desert again. The campsite area we had chosen started with a walkway from the road to the campsite. The walkway was absent of weeds and grass and lined with medium-sized rocks going to the campsite. It formed a circular perimeter that engulfed a concrete picnic table, barbecue grill mounted on an iron pole, and a fire pit. At the left side, next to the campsite, there was a small tree with one branch being perfect for hanging a water container and bamboo shower curtains. Back to Thomas. Finding a level area outside the perimeter, Susan and I unrolled the tent and spread it out in a north-south direction. After pitching the tent, we began to assemble the pyramid. A few years past, I conducted research into pyramid phenomenon, formed a company where I designed and manufactured various sized pyramids, gave lectures, and wrote books. I understand that due to the angular form and geometrical design, a pyramid retains concentrated magnetic energy currents off the electromagnetic field of the Earth when aligned with the North Pole or North Magnetic Field. This does two noteworthy things. 1. Creates an amplification of the above-mentioned energy. 2. Creates a dehydration preserving effect. The pyramid Susan and I used had an 8-foot square base, an edge face length of 91.5/16 inch, base corner to apex, and a height of 61.16 of an inch, base center to apex. It consisted of 4 copper tubes, 1/2 inch in diameter, establishing the base, 4 light tubes, though slightly shorter, establishing the edge face. 1/2 inch inner diameter holes, 1 at each end and a hole at the top with an angle of 51 degrees. The apex connected copper had 4.5 inch inner diameter holes, each with a 51-degree angle. These measurements were based off the measurements of the Pyramid of Cheops, located on the Giza Plateau near Cairo, Egypt. A formula for these measurements is base times 0.9105651, giving an edge face length from the base corner to the apex. Base times 0.63600,982 gives a height from the base center to the apex. Susan and I placed 8 tubes and 5 connectors around the tent. Taking 4 of the tubes, we inserted them into 4 connectors, forming a square base. We took the remaining tubes and inserted one end of each tube into the connectors at the base and the other end each tube into the apex connector. Using a compass, we aligned the pyramid to the north magnetic field of the Earth so one face of the pyramid would face north. Finished, the pyramid barely consumed the tent with no room to spare. I took the foam pads, sleeping bags, and pillows out of Howard and placed them inside the tent. Susan began organizing, laying out the bedding as I brought the cook stove, lantern, and utensils from Howard over to the table. After Susan had finished with the bedding, we prepared ourselves for a short walk. The day seemed beautiful with the sky blue and the sun full of yellow, and the temperature seemed in the high 70s. Earlier, Susan had made a pouch with a strap attached to both sides. The pouch will hang from the neck and hold a compact recorder. As we go on walks throughout the adventure, Susan will record conversations in relation to the many expressions of thought. Back to Susan speaking. As we were walking, Thomas commented on an area being full of small holes, no larger than a 50-cent piece. He pointed to a large mound of dirt full of the same size holes, telling me that it looked like a snake den. I remembered when we stopped in Buckeye, telling the man that asked where we were headed, that we were en route to the recreation area outside Buckeye. The man informed us that now is a good time of the year to be out here. The area is heavily populated with rattlesnakes, though they have not come out of hibernation yet. Thomas and I continued onward, talking, taking notes, following the road back around to the campsite. Walking in front of 2 motorhomes with 2 elderly couples standing by them, we exchanged hellos, conversed for a short period, then walked onward to the campsite. Thomas went searching for fallen wood as I began to get things organized to prepare dinner. After several trips, Thomas had accumulated a good-sized stack of wood. Among the wood that Thomas gathered was a fallen sahuaro cactus that had been dead for some time. He seemed amazed, observing that the cactus was merely wood, similar to a tree. I told him that he had good timing as I had dinner ready. We sat and we began to eat. We noticed small bugs, reddish brown in color, begin to cover the table. They were multiplying fast. We ate rapidly and simultaneously waved the hands to keep them off the food. Thomas said, "These insects have learned what time human animals that occupy these spaces eat. Tomorrow we will have dinner earlier and see what happens." Back to Thomas. After dinner, Susan got the pouch tape recorder and we went for a walk on the road leading around the area. I began talking. Susan had an excellent ability to get me going. I would talk as if I were reading a 1,000-page book in a somewhat short time. Once back at the site, I constructed a fire in the fire pit. I filled an aluminum container with water, put a lid on top, and placed it across 2 thick logs in the fire. The water came to a boil in a short period. Then I poured a small amount of hot water into 2 dish pans. Setting the container down, I picked up a water container and poured some cool water into the 2 pans. Susan and I washed the face and hands in one of the 2 pans, then Susan washed the dishes in the other. I emptied the pan we washed out of and rinsed it with hot water. Susan used the remaining hot water to rinse the dishes. I placed more wood on the fire as Susan sat on a good-sized log I had found earlier. The sky was rapidly becoming dark as evening came to greet us. I stood by the fire as Susan and I both looked to the stars and shared each other's thoughts. Later, I walked over to Howard and picked up the guitar, walked back to the fire, sat and picked out a few songs. The sky was dark, the stars ever so bright and so seemingly clear. There was that beauty, that indescribable beauty that thought cannot touch, that has nothing to do with thought whatsoever. Susan speaking. I enjoyed the sounds Thomas produced through the guitar and the warmth from the flames of the fire. I realized I was tired, and it seemed relieving when Thomas suggested we retire to the tent for the evening. Thomas speaking. Susan and I waited until the last log had burned and only the red-hot coals remained before concluding the day. We're going to stop here, folks, and we will start with the 1st of February. I hope you have enjoyed so far. It takes a long time. There's a lot here. We're going to get into it. Thank you, and look for the next video, please.